Hello and welcome back to Basics of Basics Cameras. In this episode, we'll cover aperture. So let's get started. Aperture is essentially a variable size hole in your lens. The size of this hole or opening is controlled by aperture blades, which you can see here. The size of the opening will be represented by f numbers or f-stop. For every lens, this maximum aperture or maximum size of the hole is different. Every lens would have their maximum written on it somewhere. For instance, here's a f2.8 lens. As you can see, f2.8 is written right on the lens. Here's another example. This lens is f3.5 to 5.6. Anytime there's a hyphen, it means that the aperture changes according to the zoom. So in this case, at 18mm on the wide end, it is a f3.5 lens. But once you zoom in to 55mm, it is a f5.6 lens. This is what you would call a variable aperture lens. The reason why variable aperture lens exist is because aperture is actually a calculation of focal length compared to the diameter of the hole. This means that whenever you zoom in or zoom out, you're changing the focal length and thus changing the value in the calculation. This is why you end up with a different f number. Obviously, this can be compensated for in design. So usually on more expensive lens, you can get constant aperture throughout the whole zoom range. But all that math and technical information is not something you need to know right now. Instead, what you should know is that the smaller the number value, the larger the opening. So for instance, f1.4 would be a large aperture or a large opening, and an f16 would be a small aperture because it has a small opening. One thing to keep in mind though, the f number written on your lens is simply the maximum aperture or the largest opening possible. This does not mean you cannot close it down to a smaller f-stop. Now that we know what aperture is, let's move on to what it does. The different aperture or different size of the opening has several different effects on your image. First one being exposure. Aperture kind of works like a hose. The larger the diameter of your hose, the more water gets let through. The same thing is true for aperture. So the larger the aperture, the more light gets through. And the smaller the aperture, less light gets through. So in other words, it is one of the crucial settings that controls the exposure for your pictures. The second thing that aperture affects is depth of field. Depth of field is a range of distance between the closest point in focus and the farthest point in focus. For a large aperture or small f number, this depth of field is very shallow. It means the range is very little. So more things are out of focus than in focus, and because of that, your out of focus backgrounds are much more blurred. If you have a small aperture or a large f number, this means that the depth of field is deeper, so you have more things in focus. Here's a side-by-side comparison of deep depth of field and shallow depth of field. There's actually a lot more to know to fully understand depth of field, but that will probably require an entire video on its own. So for now, what you should understand is that if you want to take pictures of something with a lot of depth, for instance landscapes, you would want to use a small aperture or a deep depth of field. If you want to isolate a subject from its background, you would want to use a shallow depth of field or a large aperture. On to the last thing we'll cover in this video, bokeh balls. If you were to take a picture with an out of focus background, and in that background there's some lights, when it's out of focus, those lights will become these round balls of light in your picture. That is what you call bokeh balls. The shape of the bokeh ball is actually dependent on your aperture setting. If you have your lens wide open on the largest aperture setting, the bokeh balls will be very round. But if you were to close down your aperture to something smaller, the bokeh balls will start showing edges. The number of edges on your bokeh balls are actually dependent on the number of aperture blades in your lens. The more aperture blades you have in your lens, the farther you can close down the aperture before the edges become apparent. So here's some examples of the bokeh balls at different f numbers. So in this video, we covered how aperture controls the amount of light that hits your sensor, the amount of things that are in focus at once, and the shape of your bokeh ball. And that's actually about it for a basic understanding of aperture. So I hope this video was helpful. and I'll be back with a new one very soon. If you like this video, consider subscribing and leaving a thumbs up. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, leave it in the comments below. I read all of it.